Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and a rare Saturday show. And my great friend Joe joins me on the channel to talk about the myths surrounding Easy Company, Band of Brothers, 2nd Battalion 506. Links to Joe's World War II tours. He does fantastic tours going to Normandy, the Bastogne areas, Market Garden, all that stuff are in the description below. And his We're Not Lost private podcast, which if you haven't discovered yet is definitely worth discovering. The links to that are in the description below. He's also a published author and a former Marine. So, or no, you're never a former Marine. You're just a Marine, aren't you? But good afternoon, Joe. How are you today?
It's good to see you, pal. Good afternoon, evening for all your viewers. Thanks for having me on.
Good to be here. So we were just discussing, the TV series had obviously followed the Stephen Ambrose book, and prior to that, we had the David Webster book, and people like Mark Bando and others had written generally about the 101st. But since the TV show, there's been an absolute plethora of books. There was the flurry of the ones by the veterans, then there was ones by the people kind of looking back at it and looking at the after action reports. There's magazine articles, there's internet sites, there's forums, so we should. He asks a leading question. We should be in a situation where there are less myths repeated about Easy Company, but we're not sure that's the case, are we?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. The thing is, it's not really a straight line answer for that. It's very nuanced. There has been like you said, a plethora, an outpouring of excellent work done on the company, very accurate work done on the company. And then because of the way pop culture media works, there has also been a lot of not accurate material produced. And I know you and I both spend quite a bit of time, probably less so these days, trying to steer people in the right direction and get them back on reality with it. But there's so many people out there who they latch on to a character or a theme or a battle associated with Easy Company, and they basically take it on as their crusade to produce as much as possible at it. And a lot of folks are they struggle to find the correct information, and they just go with what has oftentimes been circularly reported and not necessarily accurate. But we're going to try and get into that, aren't we?
Yeah, I mean, and this is the thing. It's about the self-appointed expert. So when I've done shows on my channel, and you've done stuff on yours, where you bring in someone who is literally the only person in the world who knows that subject. I'm thinking, for example, the 6th South African Armored Division. It's just the one expert out there. But with E Company, there are lots of self-appointed experts, some of whom know a lot of stuff, some of whom know some stuff, and some of whom, frankly, don't know, even misremember the TV show, I think is part of the thing. So we'll get into it.
Yeah, let's do this.
So you've chosen the 10 myths we're going to go to. I'm sure, folks, you'll come in with some other questions for us, but there are some sort of big ones, there are some small ones, but we'll take it through it. So number one, I'll hand it over to you, Joe. So Salty Harris and the whole busting out and the big drama of England.
Yeah, and I think we're going to have a reoccurring theme throughout this pod, through your presentation about we're battling some of the myths that came about because of the miniseries, and I will be the first one to tell you, absolutely love the miniseries, always have. Are there things that are wrong with it? Yes. Did the writers get things wrong? Yes.
I think we should just clear it up with a caveat at the beginning that we both absolutely love the TV series. We both absolutely treasure the memories we have, and you even more than I, with the men themselves and the family members and all that. That goes without saying that the respect is there for the TV show, for the men, and for the historians,
but there are plenty of things that are wrong with it. And we'll start with, I don't consider this one kind of a softball, and nor are these in any kind of ranked / curated order. They are mostly just chronologically assigned a number from 1 to 10. So number 1, Terrence Salty Harris. Now, Salty Harris was the original platoon sergeant for 3rd Platoon of Easy Company. He was a Toccoa man. He was very popular. He had gone to like a pre-university naval school to learn how to be inculcated into the military mindset. Again, very popular. And it was him and Mike Ranny who basically kicked off what would be considered the Sobel mutiny. There's a lot of other stuff that'll go along with the mutiny that we may talk about and we may not talk about in terms of accuracies. But I wanted to point out that a lot of people, because of the dialogue in the miniseries, think that Salty was busted completely out of the 506, and that is not correct. The Dale Dye, the Sync character says, "I'm transferring you out of my regiment," and that is completely incorrect. Salty was actually reassigned to B Company of the 506th, and there he remained until probably a month or so before D-Day, where he was recruited for the Pathfinders by Wally Moore, the former 3rd Platoon commander, who had left Easy Company over his disagreements with Sobel. Now, Wally also recruited my granny over to the Pathfinders, but just prior to D-Day, Randy requested a transfer back to Easy Company, and with Sobel not in command of the company, that was facilitated by Dick Winters. But for Salty, he stays with the Pathfinders and ends up jumping on D-Day with them. And I don't think a lot of people understand how the Pathfinders worked. They were essentially on detached service. And if you don't know what detached service was, I know you do, Woody. You were temporarily assigned to another unit with a finite period of time. And once that time elapsed, you would return to your parent unit. In this case, Salty ends up after D-Day returning to B Company, and he's eventually killed during the taking of Carentan. But he never leaves the 506. He stays with the 506. And I thought that was not so much a softball, but it was a good one to get out of the way, where we diffuse the myth that was developed because of the miniseries.
It also brings up an ongoing issue that someone like yourself and me have, is that there are incredibly significant figures in the formation, the creation, the training of E Company, who for one reason or another are not major characters, or even characters at all in some cases, in the TV series. And Salty Harris, I mean, you've taken family members and veterans back to the battlefields, and when I took Forrest Guth years and years ago, the one absolute thing he wanted to do in Normandy was go to Salty Harris's grave, and that was when we accomplished that. And seeing him outpour the emotion for his buddy who had died, I'm guessing it was about 65 years before, something like that, was incredible, because there's a figure who is an absolute minor character in the TV show, although having a pivotal role, as you say, but actually loomed large in their memory, I guess, their collective memory.
Yeah, I remember sitting down with Paul Rogers at one of the reunions, and we were talking about Salty, and Paul had a great sense of humor. He's a very lively guy, but I remember him openly crying, which is an unusual thing for that generation, as many of your viewers know. And then to talk to other members of 3rd Platoon about him and how important he was to them. Some of you may have known that Burr Smith, who is largely part of 1st Platoon and Company headquarters, wrote a letter to Salty's sister that basically said, "I would gladly trade places with him if it would bring him back tomorrow." I mean, that's the kind of impact he had on the company.
No, absolutely. We'll move on. Number 2, Brecourt Manor. It was only a matter of time before the legendary action of Brecourt came, and it's going to be featuring two of the myths today. So
I know this one's one of your favorites, because you and I have talked about this, quite a bit. Especially when my first trip over, we got to spend quite a bit of time, essentially with a host of Easy Company family members, where you and I literally step for step, minute for minute almost, went right across the battle space and showed everybody where everyone was, where we believe they ended up, and then how long it took for them to assault through and take the 4 gun positions, and then the subsequent fighting around the manor house as well.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I mean, absolutely love the sequence in Band, and I know you do too. I thought they just did a beautiful job with it. It's aesthetically gorgeous, and that's kind of odd to say for for a battle sequence where people are being killed, but it is shot beautifully. The actors do a phenomenal job with it. The special effects are outstanding, but really it shows it in about a compressed 15 minutes of time, where you and I know, after going over the different regimental and battalion level paperwork and talking to the vets that were there, and having written about it quite a bit myself, and I know you've covered it so many times with your tours, I mean, it's basically 3 hours. By the time it's give or take 3 hours, it's probably a little fudgy in there at the end. It could be a little bit more than 3 hours. But I know that the Winters group finally arrives nearby at about 08:30 after coming all the way from the Saint-Mary-Glisse area. And they finally arrive there, and then it takes them literally 3 to 3.5 hours if you include the rounding up of the last of the Germans around the Manor House, about 3.5 hours. So by the time they finish up, it's almost noon. Taking the entire position and the Manor House, and I know that folks love the miniseries. I do too, but there's a definite disparity between the actual time that it took and what we see portrayed on the screen. But again, full kudos to everybody involved with bringing it to life visually on the screen.
Well, I mean, the thing is, if it had been a real time frame, if they had shown it in real time, we'd have all switched off, because there were bits in it where nothing was really happening. And then there's, I mean, then there's that whole bit after they leave the manor where they're sort of clearing for positions on their way towards Cullerville. That takes an hour or two, maybe more. Essentially, they were at Brecourt for. We must specify it's only elements of the company. There are parts of the company scattered all over Normandy, but it's most of the afternoon they're in the area, aren't they? Even after the battle is well and truly over. There was no other major events that day.
By the time they finish up in the evening, they're down by Angeville and in regimental reserve. And this is, if you think about the battle space of the folks who have been on the ground in Normandy and trace these steps, you know how far. It's not terribly far to get from one to the other, but it is when it's infested with Germans. So, and you're trying to move and find your in modern parlance, or in the Vietnam War parlance, the night defensive position where you're going to set up. In fact, the CP for the 506 is down there at Cullerville, and they end up being brought in Cullerville, which is just a small little group of buildings, as you well know, and placed in regimental reserve. But they're still manning. Some of the guys are still manning holes and asleep at the switch because they've been going so long. But that's all takes place on that singular day.
Yeah.
But
I think it's also worth mentioning before we move on.
Thanks for that. Yep.
I think before we move on, it's also worth mentioning that there were other units involved in the area as well. You know, the Tank Battalion guys, D Company guys, F Company guys, company headquarters guys, other people from the 506th coming in. There are 4th Infantry Division guys floating around in the latter part of the afternoon. And again, we know that the Band of Brothers is trying to tell the story of one company. And if they had tried to portray the events of the other companies to the left, to the right in support, it would have diluted what they're trying to achieve. But I think that omission has led to people getting a bit muddled up about Easy Company's prowess, shall we say.
Yeah, and I'll say, sometimes these are 1 or 2 troops, but there are elements of Service Company 506 there. The regimental munitions officer, Andrew Hill, is killed during the attack. I mean, it's largely a 2nd Battalion show. It's not just Easy Company. The bulk of the troops come from Easy Company, but it's almost... I misphrase that. I would say at least half, if not more than half, of the troops that take part in the assault, start to finish, come from Easy Company. But the remainder are mostly from 2nd Battalion, D, F, 2nd Battalion headquarters. So, it's there's a lot of myths associated with Brecourt, and we're going to get into another one with point number 3.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's move straight into number 3.
Yeah, the Brecourt taught at West Point. Now, frankly, I don't know where this myth started. I want to say it probably started as ties to Ambrose himself in stating that. Now, if you understand how service schools work, it's easy to understand that it wouldn't be the only thing studied if it was studied. You'll do case studies based on a tactical situation to help instruct officers in development on how to manage a tactical situation. And what you want to do is you want to have a number of examples. So I doubt seriously that this was a singular point of period of instruction where it was just Brecourt being taught. It more likely have been base of fire, single or double envelopment, where you're talking about a military action, and you use this as part of your case study to show how it's done for real. So it's less theory and more actual combat instance. So again, I've never seen doctrinally anything laid out in a course of study that Brecourt was the centerpiece of any kind of teaching at West Point, whereas it was most likely used as a case study as part of a broader period of instruction.
Yeah, and then of course, when it becomes famous later on, I'm sure cadets at West Point started asking people, are we going to be covering Brecourt Manor? Because
Yep.
I've read that it's part of the, so in an end, it becomes sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because I'm sure, like when you're standing on Omaha Beach with a group, like when I am, people ask you about Saving Private Ryan, you end up talking about it because you have to, because they're going to, if you don't mention it, they're going to mention it. So I'm assuming that similar thing would have happened with this, is that it has now become part of the West Point, what do you want to call it? Not mythology, but
Yeah.
discussion points.
Yeah. Again, and not a center point of a period of instruction, but part of a broader case study on how a small infantry unit can conduct base of fire and envelopment actions. And yeah, to your point about when you're standing on a particular piece of ground and you have a pop culture reference point, especially something as powerful as Saving Private Ryan or Band of Brothers, it's the elephant in the room that you have to address right away. And you know this, and I know this because we've done it a million times. In fact, I always lead in with it. I'm like, let's get this out of the way.
Yeah, let's the elephant is here. We all can see the elephant. Let's talk about the elephant. Yeah.
And again, it's not about bad mouthing. It's just setting reality straight for you. And I always say to the folks that I guide overseas when I do that is I love it as a visual reference point for you. It gives you something in your that you can, since we weren't there and a lot of motion picture doesn't exist for some of these actions, it gives you a visual reference point. So that when you look at the ground and we start talking about people who are there, you've got something to frame of reference as you move forward. But yeah, I'm not a big fan of the whole Brecourt taught at West Point myth. It's never been proven to me directly. I mean, there has been notations in different books and stuff, but I have yet to see a positive sourcing where it actually states definitively this was done here.
Yeah, no, I agree. And also, just before we move on, Joe, we're in this beginning to the subject of whether what we're seeing on screen or what we're reading about is unique or typical. Now, I would make the point that when you look at the achievements of the American Airborne and the British Airborne on D-Day, and indeed non-airborne units, things like the assault on Brecourt Manor are more common than not common. There are lots of platoon officers plying their trade well, NCOs doing their thing well, and what Winters and Compton did at Brecourt is great, but it's no greater than countless other actions that are happening on D-Day, even within a few miles of Brecourt Manor. And I'm hoping you're going to agree with me there.
I will, and I'll say this: we might want to park that to point number 10, but the myth number 10. But I agree with you wholeheartedly. You know, the thing is, there was standardized training throughout the U.S. Armed Forces at the time. Even though airborne was a developmental arm at that point, the thing that really stands out to me is that we used to joke with some of the airborne guys when I was in the Marines, and we'd work with the 82nd. Like, we'd laugh at them and go, "Hey, you're just an infantryman. You just have a different method of insertion." Same thing with the Marine Corps, right? We're an amphibious arm. It's just a different method of insertion. And it's not to say that I'm not downplaying the esprit de corps, the airborne. I have so much respect for those guys. I have so many friends who are paratroopers and rangers who routinely jump out of planes. The esprit de corps, off the charts. I liken it to the Marine Corps. It's part of who you are. It's the fabric of your service being. But at that point, the doctrine that they were trained under was largely the same when it comes to infantry tactics. So while Winters and Compton were leading the men and doing what they did, which I still think is incredibly brave, and you just have to look at the decorations list for the men who took part in that assault. Again, just like you said, there were plenty of other units doing that same thing. Yep. They were all taught the same doctrine, and those men in the other units who are less celebrated and less well known executed them well too. And it's not to downplay Easy Company. Lord knows, everyone knows how much I think of those guys.
It's what we're doing is we're not downplaying Easy Company. We're bringing other units up to the
We're
same benchmark. That's what
we're
I say
framing.
when I'm on tours.
Yeah,
Is we're
we're
saying,
framing
okay,
it. We're
yeah,
framing
yeah,
it and contextualizing what they were. It doesn't downplay what they are, and they were a magnificent unit. And so many units that we look at or are and were magnificent units. But in this case, there are many other units that did this too, to the great credit of the United States Army
yeah.
A-
Terry Down there.
and
What?
all of our allies as well. So
Yeah,
I broaden the scope to the allied armies altogether. They all were very broadly stated, some units better than other, very good at infantry tactics, small unit tactics.
yeah. Terry just made the point there about what 231 Brigade were doing over on Gold Beach. Several gun batteries inland from Gold Beach also taken out. Royal Marine Commandos 47 at Point Sand. Very similar things. If
Yep.
you wanted to kind of use a PowerPoint to present some of their actions alongside what E Company are doing, you would find very, very distinct parallels in numbers of men, numbers of enemy, achievements, weapons they're under fire from, and you could easily draw that parallel. So yeah, it's a fun conversation. Right? Well, we're still sticking with machine guns and things, so we're moving on to number 4.
Oh, this one. So many times. I've on my own show, I did a singular episode just based on Sobel's activities on D-Day. And again, not knocking Sobel. He was a great trainer of men. And it seems that after his relief from Easy Company, he became a much more balanced leader, working in the regimental S4. Now, again, here's another example of somebody being put on detached service. Okay, when Sobel was relieved from Easy Company and Thomas Meehan was put in command, Sobel was not sent directly to Chilton Foliot. I know there's a lot of people out there who think just because of the miniseries, we're sending you to Chilton Foliot, yada yada yada. He didn't. He was assigned to the regimental S4 and then placed on detached service at Chilton Foliot. And I talked to Herb Seworth of 3rd Platoon Easy Company, and he went through paratrooper training at Chilton Foliot under Sobel, and he said Sobel was a fine example of an officer and a gentleman. You can't tell me he didn't learn his lessons. But the real thing that gets my goat is Wikipedia. And on Wikipedia, somebody uploaded as a reference an article written about Sobel getting the Bronze Star for taking out a machine gun on D-Day. So, and also jumping into Normandy on D-Day. Now, I can tell you very, very definitively, Sobel did not jump into Normandy. And I know this goes against what Ed Mauser, an Easy Company veteran from 2nd Platoon, said, that he met Sobel on D-Day morning. He very well may have, but he didn't see Sobel. In my mind, he did not see Sobel jump in. He ran into Sobel, and I think his memories were a little clouded there because based on the regimental paperwork, Sobel landed with the seaborne elements of the regiment. And this is the supply trains, which is what an S4 does for a regiment. And he received his Bronze Star for performing those duties and getting all those supplies down to where the regiment was from Utah Beach. Was he under fire? Probably. He did receive the CIB at some point, but there is no evidence that he assaulted a machine gun position. And the article that states it cites a geographical location that does not exist. Now, I attribute this to the public affairs officers that are charged with by each unit to draft good news stories to send home for the press. And sometimes they don't get the full story about what happened. So I hate to say it, folks, but people make things up. They fill in the blanks in order to tell a good news story and make people feel good about what their boys are doing overseas. I think that this is a case of that because the regimental paperwork, and by the way, he was never awarded a jump star for Normandy, which is a key indicator that he did not jump
Very
on
telling.
D-Day.
Yep.
But he was awarded the Arrowhead for his North Africa European Campaign Medal. This denotes either taking part in a parachute assault or an amphibious assault, which the landing with the regimental trains is equivalent to, because he landed on D-Day. So he was awarded the Arrowhead just like everybody else. So again, I am not downplaying Sobel's courage in doing his job, his proficiency in doing his job. He did his job very, very well. The supply trains got to the regiment where they needed to be. And that's why he got his Bronze Star. And a lot of
Yeah.
officers get meritorious Bronze Stars. If you're in the combat zone, it's not valorous, but you did your job and you did it probably under fire. So
Yeah.
I know that's going to rub a lot of people wrong way. There's a lot of videos out on YouTube of people saying, "Oh, he was a hero because he charged a machine gun position with a couple of paratroopers." There's
I
no
think
evidence.
it
Zero
stemmed from
evidence.
the fact, Joe, that there was that immediately after the TV series came out, it was purported that Sobel didn't go overseas at all. He stayed in England. So I think what happens with myth busting is in the busting of one myth, it's pushed too far the other way. So I think it was right to correct people when they said, "Oh, Sobel never went overseas." But what's happened is it's been taken too far the other way. And I think that, and it's interesting when you said about Ed Mauser, because I met Ed Mauser a couple of times in Normandy, and we had quite a high-spirited clash about dates, and it was about his recollections of the Battle of Vierville, and particularly the death of Benjamin Stoney.
And you and I have talked extensively about Stoney.
And it's and we now realize that Ed, fantastic guy that he was, his body clock was frankly all over the place, as most people would be. You know, D-Day postponed a day, you're taking motion sickness tablets, you're up for most of the night, you're high stress. And it's interesting that both of us have had this practical example of Ed getting his 6th and 7th mixed up, because it clearly happened.
I mean, we know this from talking to the men. Like when the jump was called off on the 5th, they didn't sleep. You're amped up. You thought you were going that night. Guys tried to sleep. They tried to lay down, and by admission, laid in their cots, staring at the tent ceiling, not being able to sleep. I mean, you're ramped up for several days. And I experienced this myself in 2003. I didn't sleep for 3.5, almost 4 days in a row. Your sense of time, and unless you are actively, like I wrote in a journal while I was in Iraq to make sure that I was checking my watch, I was logging things properly. And unless you're that fastidious or stupid, depending on how you want to describe me at that point, you don't know whether you're coming and going when you've been up that many days. You're literally moving from task to task. You're task oriented almost the whole time. So,
not that we're going down the rabbit hole of talking about your service and your book, but even when you were doing your book, which was what, 20, you were getting people arguing amongst your units about which days things happen in an era when it was much better recorded, because you had like even audio recordings and real GPS mapping. So the fact that soldiers or Marines get mixed up about their dates in combat is not anything new, folks. I'm sure Roman centurions were arguing about which bloody day Hannibal brought the elephants over the Alps. You know,
it's not a new phenomenon at all. Yeah, but I mean, I think we've kind of beat the Sobel stories to death. I mean, and there's a picture of him, by the way. I did the red circle around him. That was taken by Time Life outside of Carentan. Along the canal after the division had set up. He was there coordinating with the, guess what, G4 officers. So, you know, it is what it is. I hope folks will do their homework. The regimental journals, the S2 and S3 journals, the S3 journal literally said the regimental S4 arrives with supply chains. So I hope people do their homework. Those are available through the National Archives. Please, folks, just don't rely on pop culture to feed you the history on this stuff. And Wikipedia, again, not your friend.
Not always your friend. Yeah, good stuff there, but check your sources. Right, number 5. And this is probably the one I see discussed the most on the internet is Albert Blythe and his legacy. So to take us off, kick it off, Joe.
I think this is the one I see the most crusading about. You know, we have to avenge Albert because he's not here to talk for himself, and he was done dirty by the production and the writers and all that. And I can say in talking to Eric Jendronson and Bruce McKenna and a number of the writers for the miniseries, they didn't do him dirty consciously. What happened was, like Ambrose, they relied on the vets, and the vets thought he died. even Bill and Babe straight up, and Babe wasn't there, so Babe is relying on what Bill said. Bill said the kid was killed. I talked to Joe Lesneski extensively about this because Joe was one of the guys who retrieved Blithe when he was hit. And he said to me, the hole in his shoulder was large enough that Joe used to keep extra dry, clean T-shirts in his cargo pockets of his trousers. And he reached in, got a T-shirt, a white T-shirt, stuffed it in the wound, and he could fit the entire T-shirt in the wound. And when they evacuated him, Joe said, I thought he was going to die.
Yeah.
So when Bill said to the production team, he's dead, all the other vets probably said the same thing. And that's what Eric essentially told me when they were putting the Bible together, that Blithe was killed. And again, I ask that folks, when they look at Blithe and they look at how his memory was treated by the production, think of the difference between the internet in 1999, 2000, and now, and the availability of resources to fix the wrong. Okay. And there's other components to this, like why doesn't the production come out and make adjustments and fix the bad text at the end of it?
Well, this is someone just said this. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't have a good answer for that. I'm not part of the production team. I know them, but it doesn't mean I'm part of them. And I agree. There's no excuse. It's a simple fix. The crawl sheet is a simple fix, really. So I don't, unless we're going to get somebody from Playtone or HBO on to kind of walk the dog on why it's not been fixed at this point, I don't know. But we've honored Albert in the communities by fixing the narrative.
Yeah.
And I feel like we've done so much to talk about him and his fine service, including after World War II, that we've kind of rectified the problem for them. Now, does that make it better? No, because anybody who doesn't know the history of it and watches the miniseries will still think that he was killed. You can only control the things you can control. And I really don't, unless somebody has a question about a specific question about it that I have some firsthand knowledge of. I don't have a better answer. All I know is he continued to serve honorably until he passed away, ironically, over a Battle of the Bulge memorial event in the late 60s, 67. I think it was 67. I think
it was 67. Yeah. And my takeaway from the Blithe story is that, people like David O'Keefe are watching other historians. You read something written at the time that has a little detail there that you just take on board, because there are different ways of Blithe's wound being described, neck or shoulder, and the size of that injury hit can be very, very wildly different. And I'm sure I've read one account where it was a nick to the neck or a nick to the shoulder. And as you said, I remember talking to you about it. Joe's there seeing a fist-sized hole in the. Yep. That's two very, very different descriptions of the same act. And it's that whole thing of, depending on the people there who were near him, how much they saw of it, were they up close, did they hear someone else's versions of it? And suddenly someone else is just being asked to describe, what way was he hit? Oh, he was hitting the neck, he was hitting the shoulder, he was hitting the back. How that one little word they say can leave things. I remember, I'm going off on a tangent. There was, going back to Brecourt Manor, there was this Canadian guy was emailing, or he was emailing me. We're going back 15 years ago in the early days of Battle Bus. And he had paid for an aerial photo of Brecourt Manor, this, that, and the other. And he was trying to work out exactly where the guns are. Maybe we should come back to the L shape or straight line gun thing some point later on. And he was looking at these circles and, that are clearly visible on the aerial photos. And he said, what I can't understand, Paul, he said, is that on my calculations of the aerial photo, comparing it to Google Earth, blah, 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 the guns are whatever he said. They're 75 meters apart or something. But Bill Garnier says they were 50 yards apart. How could he be 25 yards out? And I went, because Bill was just asked at some point arbitrarily, how far apart were the guns? Like when you're walking down the street, folks, and someone says, where's the Walmart? Where's the Tesco's? They go, oh, it's about a mile down the road. You don't jump in your car, drive a mile down the road, stop and go, well, it bloody isn't there, and then go back and tell, you said it was a mile. It ended up being a mile point two. It was just a throwaway line. And you've dealt with that with the veterans a lot, because
Yeah.
Larkey and Compton, they went to air shows, they went to signings, and people would ask them a question and they would reply with an off the cuff response, that then that person goes away and builds an entire story about that. And it's just it could even be almost like a flippant comment, because as we know, people like Bill Garnier could be a bit flippant, could be a little bit cheeky. And you think,
Yeah, without a doubt.
You know,
Oh, I've watched Bill tool around with folks at air shows before. It was a fun thing, but he never meant anything by it. It was always meant to keep things light, because it's such a heavy topic. But at the end of the day, and this is a lesson for folks, and I hate to be a little preachy about it, but there's a difference between like doing history hits on your YouTube channel and being a historian. Now, some of us are school trained. I went to school for history. I have a degree in history. You, on the other hand, learned while doing and associating with top flight historians, and you learned how to do it correctly. You generally come from one of those two camps. I can't stress enough how important it is to diversify your sources. You can't just lean on a singular, and this. You can't just lean on our veterans, because memories fail over time, and it needs to be overlaid with official reporting, and other firsthand accounts and maps and the whole 9 yards. So be diligent with your work out there. If you're producing content, please. I spend and I know you do as well. You spend so much time putting shows together to make sure that they're historically accurate, and finding the sourcing. This was the limiter for the production team at the time. They did not have access to the sources, and you got to understand, they are fighting budget and time constraints to put this together. And so details like what happened to Albert were not meant to be malicious or damaging, but it happens when you're not diligent enough and you don't do your research.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point. Wise words, Joe. Moving on, a quickish one. This one, I think, will be.
Oh yeah, and then this one I love, because I just did a great, in my opinion, great show with Joe Hook and Edwin Popkin, where we looked at Operation Pegasus from top to bottom, from all sides, from the Dutch resistance, from the Red Devils, from the 101st Airborne side, and I understand people's eyes will glaze over, because it was like basically almost a 2-hour show. But I hope people will watch it, because it explains everything from start to finish. But I really wanted to put this one, I wanted to highlight this one, because it's one of those ones that shows up in these like quizzes where, did you know where Tom Hanks appeared in Band of Brothers? And he appears in this celebration after the rescue of the Red Devils. Well, the only problem is it never happened. It never happened. What happened was that the Red Devils were quickly spirited away once they got back across the river, brought back to the division clearing station for quick medical checks, and then quickly evacuated back off the line. The Easy Company men, once they made landfall on the opposite side, on the 101st Airborne side of the Rhine, never saw them again. But interestingly, I love the point where you see some of the Easy Company, the actors portraying Easy Company members, wearing the red berets of the British Airborne, and that is true. A number of the British veterans, as they were linking up with the E Company members on the north side of the Rhine, actually handed their berets over to the vets. In fact, my friend Les Hashey kept his till they died. A number of the men, Ralph Stafford, kept his. So I love that little bit there, but it never really happened. And there was some great behind the scenes stuff and some scenes shot for that whole sequence that never made it to the cut. And like many fans of the series, I hope some point Band of Brothers does HBO does a retrospective where they make it like 12 episodes and they stitch in a lot of that stuff, but kind of like the Big Red One reconstruction.
Well, we
Put it
we
all
can
back
hope.
in.
We've been talking and been hoping about it for, well, since the series came out. But just that comment about the rescue, because obviously Operation Pegasus is one of them. But I've got a pair of British jump wings in a frame in my other room, which were given by an first airborne guy to Cecil Simmons of the 50 Deuce, and then Mark Bando gave them to me about 20 years ago. So I've got and they're uncut. It's like it's a complete rectangle British wing that hasn't been cut to then. I guess the para had him in his Denison smock pocket, or like modern servicemen have the spare patches to give to kids. I assume it was something like that, where this British guy back from Arnhem at some point encountered a guy from the 50 Deuce, and at some point handed over his wings, and I have them. So yeah, there were connections. But yeah, the part for me, we're going into a review of the TV series. The party has a strange hollow feel to me anyway, in that I think the last things these first airborne guys would want to do is kind of, they were just exhausted. They were fucked. They wanted to sleep, I think. But anyway, that's
yeah, they've been fighting for days. They literally, and some of them like literally had they were all, first of all, majority of them were wearing civilian clothes up until the point of rescue, where they had to switch back. So I mean, there's lots of little details. Like I said, I really enjoyed doing that episode with Joe and Edwin, and if your listeners are so inclined, I think they'll enjoy it. But yeah, it's just one of those things. It's kind of one of those it's a little nettlesome to have to deal with it, but it didn't happen. I mean, the guys just went back on the line and did their jobs. In both cases. So that's a quick one.
It is. And this is a contentious one. I mean, there's a lot of stuff written, and we've got a couple of doozies coming up now, folks.
Yeah,
We've moved away from Normandy now to the snow and the cold of Bastogne. So over to you, Joe.
I think we're just going to be a little blunt with this one. The area where that's fenced in out in the Bois Jacques, where you go and you buy your ticket from the Bastogne War Museum and you go look around at some of the original foxholes. There's a lot of them that are not. That is not where the attack for Foix jumped off at. Okay, and I'm going to throw props to my friend Reg, who's been disabusing the whole Foix attack jump off points for years. Full credit to him. A lot of people don't know that at the time, 3rd Battalion was actually the lead battalion for the attack on Foix to retake it for that last time. Unfortunately, they were in much worse shape than, say, 2nd Battalion. So Easy Company ends up getting assigned to 3rd Battalion as the assault company for the attack, and as such, they get split into 2 different elements. There's the 3rd platoon element, which does that wide swing around the east side of the village, and then makes the assault up the famous roadway where the Shifty kills the sniper, and the 1st Battalion aid station was sat in the church. That's where 3rd platoon comes in. But 1st and 2nd platoons and company headquarters end up being repositioned over to 3rd Battalion's lines, and that's where they launch their attack from, which is a much more westerly approach into the village than what people think. Because you'll walk out to that position, and because you've done it, you'll walk out to that position, which is essentially where 1st and 2nd platoon's positions kind of join, and you can look right down the hill into Foix. And many people believe that's where the attack kicked off, but it's not. And if you I take the folks that come on my tours, I take them down into the area in 3rd Battalion, where you can see a lot of the G Company foxholes were, where Pee Wee Martin was, and all those fellas, where the Buffalo Farm is, and you can look right down the throat of Foix from where 1st and 2nd and company headquarters came in. But that's a pretty I'm gonna say it's an easy one, no pun intended. But that. It's just a disabuse, folks. They always go to the Bois Jacques and they're like, "Oh, here's where they kicked off the attack," and we're like, "No, they didn't. They were part of They were assigned to 3rd Battalion at the time, and they were launched from 3rd Battalion's position. So the pincer was much more wide spaced and less supporting."
And I think it just generally goes to show that, because I mean, that set that they used was so good. The inside the hangar there with the snow, there was some stuff on location. Most of it was inside the hangar. Is that if you're unfamiliar with the 101st Defense of Bastogne, the 506th, you might just assume that's one bit of wood they're meant to be able to. I know there's a scene where they returned to the foxholes and whoever it was who'd been there, and they've left a mess again. But all the units, the 1st Battalion are moving around, 3rd Battalion are moving around. It's not that everybody got into a hole on December the 17th and stayed there till February. It's not that at all, is it?
Yeah, if you think about it, it's January 13 when they launched the attack on Foix. By the time, so they've arrived in late December. They've been attrited. The
Yeah,
companies have been attrited, especially the 1st Battalion, the 506th, and the fighting around Noville early on. And those of you who have read Don Burgett's books, you know what a savage fight that was for Team Desabris and 1st Battalion, the 506th. It's a shell game, and the thing that a lot of us who are familiar with who are historians, and we look at the Bastogne fight in particular, you wonder why the Germans didn't mass all their firepower in one position and just crush a massive hole in the defensive perimeter of the airborne, and then roll right through and then spread out and just take them down one piece at a time. Instead, it's the little pinprick attacks all the way around the perimeter that allows one, General McAuliffe, who's an artilleryman by trade, to mass his fires properly, and two, it gives the guys that are already there a fighting chance. But there is a lot of that shell game going on where
yeah,
units are being moved around in the battle space they're essentially like little fire brigades where they're moved in to help knock off an attack, and then they're moved back into their positions, like we see in the miniseries when they come back from Fazone Woods and the Joe Toy characters complaining about somebody
yeah.
defecating in his foxhole. Um, you see that a lot if you've studied the battle in detail, but in this case, 3rd Battalion in particular have been whittled down. In fact, Item Company, I want to say, and Reg will probably correct me if he's watching, there were maybe 24 men left in Item Company and one officer who had just gotten there a couple of weeks prior. I believe his name is Tinsley. That's it. That's all Item Company had left. So they have to help them. They have to help 3rd Battalion. So they send Easy Company, and they're the ones who are become the lead assault echelon into the village.
And
And we're
also
gonna
worth
we're gonna
mentioning.
talk more about that in the next
I know,
one.
but
So
before we move on, though, you've taken groups to Bastogne. Reg obviously takes groups there frequently. I've been there a couple. I've never taken a tour there, but you can't possibly understand the defense of Bastogne without going to more positions than just the 506. You can't understand the Battle of the Bulge by only going to Bastogne. You have to broaden yourself. And we're back to that the Brecourt being not an isolated action on D-Day. As fantastic as the stories were that surrounded E Company in the Ardennes, you cannot possibly come away with a grasp of the magnitude and importance of that battle by just going to the Easy Company foxholes and paying your way because you have to go through the little vents now. I mean, it's not that we haven't all done that, but people shouldn't be doing just that. I think we all want to echo those ideas, is that lots more other things happen than just what happened to these incredible men that we were privileged to know.
yeah, I've actually last year was the first time I had taken just a Battle of the Bulge tour over, and we spent quite a bit of time on the northern shoulder. And it was the 80th, and I had a great time at Bastogne. And I know we're rabbit holing, as you would say. Had a great time there. It was great to see so many friends all gathered up. But I couldn't wait to get out of Bastogne proper, because it was kind of circus like. Think like Normandy D-Day anniversary light.
Yep.
But to get up to the northern shoulder, because like you said, there's so many different little fights. The Prumerberg with the engineers, if you haven't been up near Saint-Vie, if you think the foxholes at Bois-Jacques are impressive, get yourself up over there, because it's just,
Yep.
and it's amazing. They were all in situ, undisturbed, unlike the foxholes at Bois-Jacques. There's so much to see and do in the Ardennes. I highly recommend it. But yeah, but you have to have a start. This is like a gateway drug, the way I look at it.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Battle of the Bulge. It gets you interested, and then you can look on at the other the battles of the 7th Armored Division, at Saint-Vie, and then further up north. And then you look at like Poteau, where you got these small units, Task Force Maze and the others that are fighting in that area. They get overwhelmed, trading space for time, and a lot of times trading lives for time and space. The small units that will never know the names of every man that are in that unit that got overwhelmed and wiped out, but it plays a key role in offsetting the German timeline, which is really the critical facet of all this for the German attack. And
Mm.
I know, again, we're rabbit holing really badly, but I hope everybody's still following along and their eyes haven't
Well,
glazed
well, they
over.
are. It's good. It's great view as well. I think another thing, just before we move on, is that we need to always remind ourselves that the makers of a TV show are introducing peripheral units, people for storytelling purposes. So in order to reinforce the idea of the 101st moving in a desperate situation, because there are one of the things we love about Band of Brothers, there aren't these big sprawling narrations where a general stands around a map. You're boom, like with Saving Ryan, you're straight in the landing craft, you're straight there. So the depiction of perhaps some of the 28th Division guys bedraggled on the way back doesn't accurately display what the 28th Division were doing and other units elsewhere in the Ardennes, but it did serve the purpose narratively. And if people wanted to, they could then use it, as you say, as a gateway drug and go on look about why the 28th were in that situation. What have they done previously? How many of them in critical actions they've been involved in? But you couldn't possibly have had a scene where someone just says, oh, these guys have come back. They've been holding the line up there. There was this particular place here they were holding. It would have derailed the project. So we understand that. And it's,
you have a finite amount of time to work with when you're telling that story. But for folks who have looked at the 28th Division, I know that do your research, read about the Hurtgen Forest, understand why they are where they are and in the condition they are, and then do them some justice. Go back and look at Team Snafu in Bastogne Perimeter, and how they perform. There's so much to you can open your optics up so much with, like you said, the periphery units that are there in the mini series, but they've done a lot more and been in a lot more places, and there's a lot more. If you're into small unit actions, there's so much out there to read and catch up on, and veteran accounts as well. So,
and we know we are in that position. I mean, both of us can name lots of people that were teenagers when Band of Brothers came out who are now published authors. Off the top of my head, Adam Berry, Matthew Pellet. I mean, the list goes on of people who were fired up on a very not narrow, but they saw the TV series, loved it, didn't know much about the peripheral units, as we're calling them, which isn't really a fair term, but it's the one I've been using, and then have gone on to become masters of their own history with that kind of one foot still in the Band of Brothers fandom. That I'm still there. I'm still got a huge foot in the Band of Brothers TV series love. I still love it. But I've also stepped out of the circle. The rest of my body has now been embracing what these other units did. So we'll move on. We're still in Foix.
Yeah, this one gets a lot of runway with a lot of folks, all because of one thing, and that was Clancy Lyle's account of seeing. He thought he saw Dike get wounded during the assault. Now, the thing that you have to understand is, and in talking to Jack Foley, who was leading 1st Platoon at the time, and talking to Frank Briccani and several of the other vets that were there, you'll understand that. You quickly develop the idea that disabuses you of the Dike wounding piece. First and foremost, Clancy doesn't make it into Foix until later in the day, because what happens is during the main assault, as 1st Platoon and 2nd Platoon are running along with the company headquarters, as depicted, holds up near a haystack, and at that point, as Lipton stops and goes, and this is the actual action, not the miniseries action. Lipton goes and links up with Dike at the company CP, and they decide to pull all of the company's machine guns and mortars into a single position. And we'll call it in battery. I like to refer to. They'll have them in battery. They'll provide the supporting fire for the assault elements going into that fire. And a lot of folks that are watching and listening know what U.S. Army doctrine is. You put your machine guns in a position where they can fire on the objective that covers the assaulting forces in, so they can get within rifle and grenade range. That's exactly what they decide to do. They use the mortars to suppress the German fire. They use the machine guns to suppress the German fire. Well, guess what? Clancy Lyle was a machine gunner. So he gets put in battery back at the company headquarters while the assault elements of 1st and 2nd Platoon continue on. All right. There, in addition to no one else seeing Dike get wounded, there is no paperwork trail. I have my eyes have bled for how many hours I have spent looking through morning reports and Purple Heart records to see if there's any record of Dike being wounded, and not just in Easy Company. I've looked in service and regimental headquarters because that's where he was reassigned afterwards. I don't think people understand how the personnel actions worked within the 506. Generally, when you arrived at the 506, you were nominally placed in service company. And for service company, even if you only spent a day, a paper day or administrative day in service company, you were then assigned to another unit, whether it's regimental headquarters or it's E company or item company or whatever. You spend there. It's like the body pool in service, in addition to having a lot of the other, again, service line items like the motor pool and things like that are also in service company. The parachute maintenance guys are in service company, but there's no record of him being wounded in any way, not severely wounded, lightly wounded, etc. In the service company morning reports, the regimental headquarters morning reports, and the Easy Company morning reports for a plus and negative 5 days around the assault on Foix. In fact, I believe I even went further. I think I went 10 days out just to ensure that it wasn't backtracked into another morning report and added late. I even went so far as to go in through the end of January and into February for those units in particular to see, again, maybe it was a late entry. There is no record of him being wounded at Foix. And I know people love to pin it on Clancy's observations, but he wasn't the only guy there. And the guys that I talked to don't recall him being injured. And there is no paperwork trail that says he was injured. So I don't know how much more evidence people need. I know it's just me speaking here and they don't have access to the morning reports. Again, this is where I recommend people doing their own due diligence. The National Archives is right up there in Maryland. And nowadays you don't even have to go. You can solicit somebody to do the research for you. And then the rest of the records are kept in St. Louis, and you'll always get that it burned up in the fire, blah, blah, blah. That's a bunch of crap. They can reassemble a veteran's service record book for you.
Yeah.
So you just have to know how to ask. But in this case, indeed, there is no paperwork trail that says Dike was wounded at Foix.
Just before we move on, because people will only ask, where are we in assessing Dike? I mean, how would you describe, in a couple of minutes, his service? Because he was portrayed pretty negatively in the series, and rather like in an echoes of the Blithe story and the Sobel story, he has been reevaluated in the 20 years since, but maybe possibly pushed a bit too far the other way again. How would you define him?
I have a lot of time for Dike. And the reason I have a lot of time for Dike is because he performed heroically in combat. He landed in Holland, did gather up a number of paratroopers around him, and then moved out smartly towards the bridge. And he was awarded a Bronze Star for that at the bridge at Son, who we've been to, the Wilhelmina Canal. He performed heroically there, and he was justly rewarded for it.
Yeah.
With that said, when he joined the 506th, he was not an infantry officer. He was a supply officer, and he was assigned to service company for quite a while, bounced between regimental headquarters and service. And then he was up at division headquarters for a while. So what I mean to say is that he is not trained. He had limited infantry training. And he is placed in command of a parachute infantry company that is going to execute a double envelopment attack on an enemy-held village. This is the most unforgiving environment for somebody, even a fully trained, consistently trained infantry officer, which he was not. Did he crumble, crack up, whatever way you want to look at it? Yes. By all accounts, from the vets that I talked to, Dike did not handle himself well during that assault. He was in over his head. Does that mean he's any less heroic? No. He was out of his league. He was out of his depth. So when I say I have a lot of time for him, I have a lot of understanding because I've served with a lot of people who were not fully trained infantry and have been stuck in infantry positions and seen them perform poorly. It's not your job. He's just trying to do the job that he's assigned. I think that I think that folks should really keep that in the back of their mind as they view him. And again, we have all this time since to adjust our optics and how we view it. And do I think it was portrayed? He was portrayed poorly, or presented poorly in the miniseries. Yeah, he probably could have been presented a little bit. They could have said, "Hey, you know," there could have been a throwaway line in one of the discussions that the guys sitting, where they were making fun of the size of the foxhole that Dike sat in, which, by the way, according to several of the vets, was about the size of a hotel. They, you know, if they had a throwaway line and said, "Yeah, but he did get that Bronze Star in Holland for you know, gathering up a bunch of guys and heading off to the objective," they could have at least said, "Hey, he performed heroically at some point." And then it might have helped to balance the sheet a little bit with him.
But there's no way they'd have done that, though, because they needed to have the
They need a
spear
foil. They need
white
the bad
knight.
guy.
The white knight has to come in to save the day. That's part of the narrative. I mean,
It's
just before
storytelling.
we move on, it was after one of the events in Normandy years ago with Peter McCabe, who of course played Dike in the series, and we'd all had a few too many sherbets, and he was talking about the fact he'd gone for the Spears role, then ended up getting the Dike role, and didn't have the time to bond with the other actors. And I'm doing a condensed version of the story, but after a few beers, we were all sitting around the table, and he said, as an actor, he'd had days that go well in theater, performances that have gone badly. He's, you know, like with us and YouTube and podcasting, you have the one where you think it's gone fantastic. Other days, your words don't come out, you whatever, you know. And Pete said to us all, there's a group of us sitting there, he said, would any of us here like to be judged forever by history for our worst day of at the office? And I think that's a very pertinent comment, is that Dike, that moment in Foire was almost certainly the worst of his military career. It was a perfect storm. He was exhausted. It was, as you say, he's out of his depth in terms of the mission he's been given.
Acumen.
Things went wrong, and it was the worst day of his life. And there he is. History, because of the people, because of that TV show, have now decided that he is a bad person based on that one day. Whereas most of us, I would like to be judged at the end of my life for the average performance over a long time, not just the odd days I've had things have fucked up, or conversely the days where things have gone really well for me, because we've had those days as well. I mean, Winters at Brecourt, for example, is an example of a perfect storm of brilliance, isn't it? He had the right people. It worked. Yeah, the recce worked well, and it all. I'm not comparing Winters and Dike in terms of their training, but in terms of just the how things play out.
Yeah, I mean, if he had more consistent infantry training as a troop leader, he would have known that you don't halt the attack. You need to carry the attack in. Just the way it basically, the way Winters is coaching him in the miniseries, that's exactly what he needs to do. And I don't know if they did that as on purpose to show he was just not paying attention or not doing what he was told, but they were showing his lack of training, that he needed to be coached, and then he didn't do what he was coached to do because he didn't have enough time to learn it. Again, you got to have some runway for the guy. I mean, how many of you and myself included, and I've been under fire before, how many of you would react that way if you were not a fully trained infantryman? I mean, have some compassion, especially now the guy's not alive to defend himself.
Exactly. And I made my mistake. I said Peter McCabe, and I meant Peter O'Meara. So I made my mistake there. There's Jason O'Mara.
We met Peter in Toccoa, and he's a very nice guy and very well spoken. And he echoed some similar thoughts from what he said to you in one of the panels. But very interesting to have him there and provide some of the insights the way he performed. Yeah, I think he was a little disappointed to get that role in particular. Like you said, he went for the Spears role, and but he absolutely loved the fact that he had got to be able to bring that to the screen. But yeah, I think he wishes it was a little bit different in terms of the turnout, because everybody looks at him and goes, "Oh, that's the guy who played Dike." You know, like nobody wants to talk to him, and all the other actors have like 15 people around them. You know, like he's got 2 people talking to him. But
no, absolutely. Well, We've
But
done that
have
one.
some time for Dike. Have some time for Dike.
Yeah, have some time for Dike. We should. There should be some kind of a buzzword that something that rhymes with Dike. Dike time or something. But anyway,
Yeah,
yeah.
same with Sobel. I feel the same way. You got to have some time for these guys.
But
they are
we're all
critical figures within the actual history of the company.
and I think that's a very good pertinent point to mention the fact that everybody who passed through the 506 had reached a level of competence. And of course, some were very, very good at their jobs, and some were okay at their jobs, and some were not so okay. That's just life. Who knows what's going to happen. But all of those people, whether they reached the heights of receiving Distinguished Service Crosses or Silver Stars, or they were one of the also rans, to use a horse racing analogy, they were all part of it. They were all part of that legacy, and we need to respect them all. And there we are. So Eagle's Nest. So I'm interested in your take on this.
Well, the records prove that Easy was not the first element into Eagle's Nest. Obviously, you'll see the picture of the 3rd Infantry Division guys, and I want to say there was 7th Infantry Regiment were the first in there, but they were quickly ushered out. There's a very good account. I want to say it's Peter Caddick Adams has it in his book, where he talks about the units that roll in and then roll out, and how quickly they're ushered out for reasons that are not largely. They're not informed by. Like the 3rd Infantry Division is like, well, we captured it, why can't we keep it? Well, tactically they needed to be somewhere else, and that's, in the end, that's why the 506 is assigned it. But the 506 and Easy Company are definitively not the first unit into Eagle's Nest, the first U.S. Army unit into the Eagle's Nest, and that was a kind of an easy one. There's photographic evidence of it. There's records that are evidence of it, official records. So, and I don't think that one gets a lot of play nowadays. I think that one's kind of been debunked early and often, but I think it needs to be in there.
Yes, but no, but there's also that. There's the photo of the officers up at the Eagle's Nest, which includes other officers from the 506. And I think it's also a reminder, folks, that our use of language, because there's Birch's Garden as a village, there's the Eagle's Nest, there's the area. And in the area, you have French troops, you have American infantry, you have paratroopers. And so when you're making a statement, you have to be clear about which specific part of that geographical location you're talking about, because the Eagle's Nest means a specific thing. Birch's Garden village means a specific thing, or the area is another definition of it as well, in that, that mountainous area of, so it's, what language you use is very important as well.
And on top of it, there's nobody standing there with a stopwatch checking in the first unit gets in there. But by and large, the official reporting, the operational reporting, has the 3rd Infantry Division in there first. So that one's kind of an easy one. But like you said, there's some geographic.
What does it matter anyway? What does people always saying, what was the first building liberated on D-Day? Who was the first person? So it doesn't matter, does it? You don't win an engagement by who was there first. You win by the teamwork info. So to me, it's irrelevant data. It doesn't make a difference who was there first. What matters is what had the journey been to get there? What was the significance of liberating that area? That exactly, as you say, who was first by the random metric of a stopwatch makes no difference at all. So there we go.
Yep.
So the last one, then we'll do some questions. So this is because you gave me 9, you couldn't come up with a 10th one. This was kind of my one, wasn't it? Really, I suppose.
Yeah. And I did come up with a 10th one, but it was when we were sitting there talking in the waiting room before we went live. But yeah, this one, this is going to be a matter of opinion, and we could put as much data out there as we want and talk about all the units as we want. Somebody may have an entrenched idea. Like I can tell you right now, the Easy Company family members that are probably watching are going, well, they were special. I know they were special. My guy was special, and I would expect that out of them. And they were special, but they were just as special as everybody else in my mind. The 506 in particular, as we talked about, was an exquisitely trained unit. And I would say that every one of the companies in the 506, and I'll even go so far to say is in the 101st Airborne, were extremely well-trained infantry units that could all do these jobs that they were given. It's just Easy has had the bulk of the illumination on them because they had a book and a miniseries done about them. And this is, again, not to detract against the Real Easy Company. We know how good an infantry unit they were, but
Yeah,
we also want to talk about how good the rest of the 506 and
exactly.
by and large the entire Allied force was. I mean, think how quickly, start to finish, after D-Day, the Reich falls. And I'm not saying, this is definitely not a slight against our allies. They were holding the line while we were sitting on the sidelines.
Yeah.
Um, they were fighting the Germans to a standstill. But if you think about how bad the American army performed in North Africa in 1942 to how well they perform in 1945, think of how short a learning curve that is. And it all starts with the basic building blocks of an infantry unit. And Easy Company was one of those exquisitely trained units, especially within the 506. I look at all of the companies of the 506 as exquisitely trained because they were. Were some through difficulties and through situational issues like a Captain Sobel or whatever, trained to a little bit higher degree. I wouldn't call it a higher degree. There's a different level of stress that's added to it's different components to it that kind of, it's like when you have a bottle of oil and vinegar and spices for a salad, right? And you let it sit for a while and everything kind of settles. You need something to shake it up to make it its truest form. And in the case of Easy Company, I think you needed that Sobel to shake up that oil and
Yeah.
vinegar to get it to its truest form, its best form. Did other units need to be tempered in the same type of fire? No, I don't think so. There were quite a bit. I used to tease the guys, as having gone through Paris Island. I said, you guys had one Sobel. I had 3 of them. So, and they used to tell me where to go, what to do with my hat. And some of the guys that know that,
Yeah.
that phrase that the boys used to use with about what you could do in your hat. But I mean, it is what it is. You need, and in their case, they needed that to bond them. But
Exactly. And I think
every unit
your
had
point,
a bonding.
yeah,
Every unit
your
had a
point
bonding.
about the family members is very apt, because I've had the privilege of meeting family members of various different units in Normandy over the years, from the Northants Yeomanry to the Stormont Dundas and Glengarry Highlanders from Canada to 507th guys. All of their family members think their granddad, their dad, their husband was special, and that their grandfather's unit was special. And when you're in the military, whether it's the British Army, American Marines, whatever, you don't, run around the compound shouting, "Who do we want to be? Mediocre." Let's make sure we're okay. That's not how it fucking works, is it? You're constant. If you're building bridges, you're the best bridge builders in the British Army. If you're flipping pancakes, you're the best fat pancake flippers in the US Navy. That's just how it bloody works. So of course there's
You have to
unit
build the
pride.
esprit de corps. It's a lifeblood of a unit is its esprit de corps. And I will say this again, we'll use it like the gateway drug that it is. I used my interest in it. Saving Private Ryan reignited my love for World War II history, because when you're serving actively, you don't have the time to spend doing research and reading all the books you want to read because you're duly occupied. And in this case, I used it to look at all the other units that especially if I talk about them on my tours. And when you get down to it and you start reading war diary entries and you couple that with the maps and you read the accounts of the men that served in them, or you read in the operational journals from US units, you start to see the consistency all the way through of the quality of these units. And I think I'd probably end this myth saying the same thing that the boys used to say. We were just another company in the Allied force. We were no better or no worse than them. And we were just part of a grand organization that ended up defeating the Nazis. I mean, they didn't consider themselves, at least in their later days when they had perspective. Back then you had that fire in your belly, you had that esprit de corps. I'm the best, we're the best. I understand it. But as you get perspective in your later life and some experience, a little bark on you, you start to understand that, yeah, we were just part of the big picture, the big force. And And I think that they took a lot of opportunities to do that. As far as I'm concerned, every time I saw them engage the crowd about that particular topic, we were just one part of the machine. So
Yeah.
as
Well,
much as
I mean,
as
I
much as
always said
people like
that.
to say that one's my favorite and they're the best, these guys didn't view it that way in their later lives.
No, I mean, you more than me, but me too, and Reg, we spent time with these guys, and absolutely every single time they would begin a sentence with "We were not, no, you know, our respect goes to the other units." Bill would mention his brother who, died in Italy. They would always do that. The fact that the public put them on a pedestal is not the fault of the veterans. The veterans reluctantly were pushed onto that pedestal in some ways and dealt with it with dignity and humor and self-deprecating squaddy humor, but they were always played fair. We did have a question about this specialness. History War Cinema says, wasn't Easy used the most as the main assault company with others in reserve more on their flank, or is this also not true?
Based on company level and battalion level actions, Easy did lead the attacks more often than not. And the only reason I will say that is if you look at the composition of the 2nd Battalion headquarters, part of the fallout from Sobel's leadership during Toccoa and afterwards was a lot of officers leaving the company and going to 2nd Battalion headquarters. So you have folks like Clarence Hester he was the original executive officer of the company and eventually becomes the operations officer in the battalion. He starts there. Sal Matheson ends up in regimental headquarters at first as the adjutant, and he works in several other positions. He started out in Easy's 1st platoon as a platoon leader. As these guys ascend to different levels of the 506th, you go to what you know. And in Hester's case, he actually wrote in his notes back and forth with Dick Winters, "I'm sorry I picked Easy so many times, but I knew you guys and I trusted you." I mean, is there empirical data that supports this? I could go back and start looking through all the major actions and look at who the point element was and tell you emphatically that it was Easy Company. I could do that. I haven't done it up to this point, only in passing when I've gotten asked that question before. But I would say more often than not, but the gap is probably not as wide as everybody thinks it is.
Yeah.
And
And
I only heard Don Malarkey call them the assault company of the battalion. I never heard any of the other vets. And it's not me throwing shade at Don. Don was a good friend and I love that man. But I never heard any of the other guys call themselves the battalion's assault company because they were all trained the same way to do the same tasks. So, but I would say that, yes, I would say they were the point element on more assaults than the other companies, but I don't think the gap is as wide as everybody thinks it is.
So we had a comment from Willie Robertson saying, I spoke with someone who was a small boy at the time they went through a pottery. He said the series could be written about any of the units. That's just an observation there. David O'Keefe is saying, does Joe teach now? If not, he should. That's from I hope.
From coming from David, I really appreciate that. An esteemed historian and definitely a pathfinder, especially with your work on DIEP. I don't teach. I actually work for the U.S. government right now, doing a day job that helps me fund my side hustle, which is writing books and doing the podcast and guiding tours. But thanks so much for the comments, David. I appreciate it greatly.
So I was expecting some subjects to come up in the sidebar that didn't come up, and there were subjects that came up that I weren't expecting to come up. The most requested, that we had 3 or 4 comments, which surprised me. So we will address that, is about the other officers in the company. So Terry Downs said, I believe there have been some different opinions on Shames and Peacock. It'll be interesting to see if Joe addresses that. Dave Kelsey, Winters versus Shames versions, same war. And Terry Down, what are the latest takes on Peacock and Shames? So, I mean, we're talking about, what, 20 odd officers went through E-Company in terms of World War II, something like that?
Sounds about right. I'd have to go back and pull the actual numbers, but yeah, based on, well, I mean, if you go back to Toccoa, it's probably closer to 30 because they were churning guys in and out that first 2 weeks in August of 42. So these are delicate topics, and I'm going to try to do my best to answer them without ruffling too many feathers. Peacock and I count Tom Peacock, so the original Peacock went by Art or Arthur,
Right.
not as Tom Peacock. His, I believe, great nephew is a friend of mine on Facebook, and I talk to him quite often. And Tom is has a unique view of his great uncle, because Tom served in the U.S. Army and in the infantry, and he feels like, if my great uncle, was a lousy officer, he should be portrayed as such, because he had his own experiences with lousy officers. And I went to him and I said, well, basically, he suffers from a lot of the same issues that Dike did, in that he was not a trained infantry officer. He did go through some limited infantry training, just like Dike did. He was a supply officer, but he happened to be the next guy in line available to command a rifle platoon when it was needed. And as you know, and a lot of your viewers will know, the airborne tended to double stack officers
Yeah.
in its rifle platoons, because they incur so many casualties because they lead from the front. And Peacock was meant to be the secondary officer and learn under the tutelage of a guy named Charles Hudson. Charles Hudson had been the first sergeant from A Company of the 506, and Charlie was wounded early on in Operation Market Garden, and Peacock ends up taking over the platoon and essentially running it all the way through to Bastogne, where he was indeed sent home on a war bond tour. After the war, we never get his view of anything, because soon after the war, he's killed in an automobile accident. So we never get to hear Peacock's side of everything. We can only pull together what the men said about him. And again, there's a big difference between what the men said during the war, when they're 19, 20, 21, 22 years old, and when they're in their 60s, 70s, 80s. So I would say some of the men were harsher about Peacock, and generally those are the ones who served under him in combat. And I won't drop those names just out of respect for them. Shames is a more complicated character.
That's an understatement. Yeah.
And Ian Gardner, God bless Ian. I love him to death. And I had a great time. He actually asked me to help out on a couple of his books, which I was glad to do, because he's such a good guy and he cares so much about the men of the 506, especially the 3rd Battalion. He wanted everything to be accurate. But I found that a lot of times some of the things Shame said were very self-promoting and slightly disingenuous. Not to mention, I had some issues personally as a retired service member of his actions in combat, things that he only started to talk about later in life. And I will say, and that's a tough one to tap dance around. I don't believe a lot of the things that he wrote about. And when I worked with Ian on Ed's biography, which Ed didn't know I was helping at the time, because he never would have done it. He would have never participated in it if he knew I was involved, because he and I didn't really get along, because his memory wasn't very good. The first time he was ever interviewed by Ambrose, he couldn't remember what platoon he commanded. He couldn't remember Shifty Power's nickname. There were lots of inconsistencies in his recollections. And I can tell you, folks, memories don't improve with age. Again, I have a lot of respect for the men that served in the 506, especially 2 jump vets, but there's a lot of inconsistencies in some of the things that he related. Again, center staging himself. I have a lot of letters, copies of letters from the men who have some very definitive opinions about him, which softened later in life. I will say that.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I tend to go with the accounts that are corroborated by other veterans. And many times, some of the things he's said has stood alone without any corroboration. So I'll leave it at that. I'll try to be as tactful as possible.
It's a very fair comment. I probably end up spending more time with Ed Shames than you did, and with Ian Gardner as well. And I had some good times, and there were some moments I was just shaking my head. Is this the same guy that, like, overnight his personality would change? One day he'd be singing everybody in the 506 was fantastic, third battalion is my spiritual home, and the next day he was all E Company. And I was tired after spending time with him. I enjoyed some of it, but I felt it was just he was a very complex individual with a lot of a massive great career and a very important career, and being one of the few. I mean, he was the last surviving officer who was giving interviews, wasn't he? And kind of got a bit of a carte blanche to sort of say whatever he wanted. And I think sometimes it was also people urging him on as well, people provoking him, and he. So we're back at this subject, is that they have become the most micro-studied unit of World War II, and people were trying to find every scrap of information about them, are interviewed endlessly, and therefore we've got too much information about them in some ways. So therefore, it has highlighted the differences of opinion.
Yeah, and I know that that James has his fans out there, and everybody's entitled to support the vet they want to support. I've spent quite a bit of time before the two of us had a falling out, talking to him in-depthly about different actions and things that were done. And I know, again, I talked about some of his conduct during the war, which later in life he freely admitted in social settings where he was being videoed, where he talked about some of the things he did, especially in Bastogne, which I am not, I find abhorrent. So I think I don't really want to say much more, because again, we had a very complicated relationship. I remember going to a reunion one time, and I was standing there talking with Eddie Joint and Don Malarkey and Brad Freeman, and he literally stood up in front of a whole room of people and said, "I'm the last remaining member of the company that was on Operation Pegasus." And I looked at Don and Brad and Eddie, and they were like dumbfounded, because every one of them was on that rescue.
Yeah,
and he stepped away from the crowd that he was talking to, and I said, "Ed," and I pointed to the three of them, and Don just shook his head and walked away, because they were not fans of each other. And Eddie and Brad just went off and went with the other second platoon guys that were there. And James, gave me the, I say I was the last member of the company that's alive. And I said, "No, Ed, they were there. Like, they were there on the rescue." And he wanted to argue with me about it. And I said, "Okay, you're right." And I walked away. It's a very complicated relationship with him.
But ultimately, I think Michael Ackerman, who will be on next month with another homage show, they're people like us. They're flawed and complex.
Exactly.
I think
great point, Michael.
One of the knock-on facts of the series is that they were elevated, these human beings, to almost superhero status. Dick Winters particularly has been put on such a impossibly high pedestal. He's almost like a biblical figure now, which we all know that these people were not without their flaws. They had all of them, every one of them, like me, had their issues. They had their favorites. They had people they didn't like. They were things they would grumble about, and that is far more interesting than having them as this idealized hero
binary
worship.
Black and white view of who they are. Think of how like you said, think how complex you are as a human being. Every one of these men was, and they have, by and large, group PTSD on top of it all.
Yeah.
And then the experiences of 80 plus years of life layered on top of that. Think of how complex a human being they are. To go back to the winner's point you just made, I get asked quite a bit, like, whether I support, and I know you've done a panel on the elevation of awards.
Oh, we haven't done it yet. We're going to do it. Yeah.
Oh, you're going to do it. And I will say, I get asked routinely, do I think it's warranted to upgrade his Distinguished Service Cross to Medal of Honor? And I look at the action, and I look at all of the interviews that I've done and talked to the men about it. I feel he was given the correct award for his level of action.
Yeah, me too.
Doesn't mean I don't think it wasn't heroic. My God, it was, along with all the other men that were part of that assault. But typically, Medal of Honor actions are awarded for a singular person's actions, not a
Yeah.
group's action. So I get asked that quite a bit. I mean, I served with 2 Navy Cross awardees, and I know what the criteria looks like for the elevation award. And I get asked that quite a bit. But he was as complex as any other member of the company.
Very.
He was very peculiar
when
and
people...
very and he did not want to disappoint people either. That was the thing. Part of the reason why he became so secluded near the end of his life was because he was suffering from Parkinson's, and he did not want people to see him in a condition that was different from what he's been placed in the public eye. And so he basically became sheltered after that, and you had to respect that. I never met him personally. I exchanged letters with him and postcards and such. And truthfully,
one very brief telephone call, but yeah,
he did it on the sly too, because Ethel definitely was the in charge in the household.
She was the powerhouse in that relationship, by a country. And the Medal of Honor thing, the thing that I feel that we're going down a massive rabbit hole is that when people talk about him he should have got the Medal of Honor, the implication is that Distinguished Service Cross is somehow not an incredible achievement. And it's like,
it's literally the second highest award for bravery that the U.S. Army gives.
Yeah, it's like, it's only the Distinguished Service Cross. What? They aren't given out with the rations.
Yeah, it's not something you find in your ration pack. Like there's a component to there's a minimum criteria. That has to be a number of people nowadays. I know what the criteria is nowadays. Back then, it was probably a little bit different, but there are a certain amount of witnesses to the action that can corroborate the action. Again, it has to be a singular action for the Medal of Honor. And then it has to have a cascading effect. Like, it's not just, did you save the guys around you? Like, this is why the Brecourt piece gets so much traction in terms of a Medal of Honor discussion, because of the impact at Utah Beach, by the loss of the artillery pieces. But there's no way to calculate that. I mean, you could say if they were continuously firing over a period of time and the landing echelons continued to come in, by and large, they would wound or kill this many service members coming in. But you couldn't say it for real because it didn't happen. Like, you can't award him something for something that didn't happen.
But then you can extend that to Pointe du Hoc, Merville Battery, San Marcouf, and if this had done what it could have done, this could have had this effect. Then you can't. Then everybody gets a medal. And then it becomes so
participation trophies for everyone. Let's do it.
It is an odd conversation, this, and I feel that when it gets to slighting the Distinguished Service Cross, it becomes a little bit odd. And we can always revisit this again at a later time. But I think this sums it up very well. One more. Yeah, go on. Oh, we got one bonus.
You want to do the bonus? The bonus myth. John Julian. This one routinely gets messed up because of the date on his headstone of when he was killed, and it says 1 January 1945. That is incorrect. John Julian was killed on 21 December 1945. It's that famous patrol that we see in the miniseries, but that occurred on the 21st of December, and this was corroborated by multiple members of 1st Platoon when Julian was killed. Now, why? I always get asked, why do they have 1 January on his headstone? It's most likely either 1, the date his body was recovered and turned over to graves registration, or 2, the date his body was interred. That's why it's on the headstone. Yeah. But emphatically, I will state, based on all the interviews and the battalion records for that period, when that patrol went out, it went on the 21st of December. It was essentially a combat patrol to establish where the forward lines of the Germans was, across from them in the Bois Jacques. And the folks that have gone out with me know exactly where it is. We've toured up there. I've toured there with Reg. We've told the story 6 Ways to Sunday with all of the different participants, because that's the other thing. There's always, I always get questioned, like, who was on the patrol and who saw this and who saw that. Well, we go into that in great depth on my tour, but just for brevity's sake, it's the 21st of December 1945. So if you're interested in that kind of detail, there you have it.
Brilliant. And as I've said earlier, folks, the links to Joe's touring tours this year are in the description below. And I think my final word on Medal of Honor / Victoria Cross is, I have a simple policy. If you have the conversation about whether or not it should have been, it isn't. Because to me, an absolute slam dunk Medal of Honor or Victoria Cross, you read it and your jaw hits the floor and you go, holy crap, how could anybody possibly have achieved that? That's to me is the bench. And that's not in any way saying that anyone who earns a Distinguished Service Cross or the Military Cross or the Military Medal has somehow performed less well. It's just that there's a sort of a line that has to be crossed, a line of almost unbelievability, a line of just something that you go, holy crap.
Superhuman.
And if it doesn't fulfill that criteria, it probably isn't a Victoria Cross or Medal of Honor. That's my particular way of analyzing it.
Yeah, the awards process, and I'm assuming in the British Army as well, has always been a dicey subject because it tends to be subjective when it's written. It's written by somebody who is initially written by somebody who is either part of or observed the action itself, but then it gets filtered through multiple layers in the review process that doesn't necessarily do it any favors. I saw this happen with my own Marines in Iraq. So I would say just be careful with the how you view the awards. A lot of times they're like we talk about you know, the awards that Dike was presented, his award for Holland, you know, he did act heroically, but somebody wrote that up and then somebody else filtered it up through the awards board. So
I like to find, often when you can, I like to find what was said at the time by platoon sergeants, a fellow officer, because there was a certain style the actual citations were written with, where you kind of sense that you recognize it was some bloke in an office writing it up, pulling out from his thesaurus of for extraordinary valor beyond the sense. And actually what was said by the eyewitnesses is actually far more telling than the rather not sanitized, but standardized ways citations read, where you can almost swap them over because they do have that familiar language to them.
Yeah, typically the write-ups are quite long, and it has to be distilled down into what actually goes on the citation. Essentially, you're getting what we call in the business an executive summary of what you've read over the page of you know, like one of my Marines that we wrote up for an award. It was basically a page and a half write-up for a particular action. But once it's approved and the citation is drafted, it's an executive summary of that. It basically turns it into a single paragraph with the 5 W's. So having read quite a bit of World War II award citations, I know that they pretty much, the system hasn't really changed.
It's things have not moved. Well, we will leave things there. It's been absolutely fantastic, and people are going, well, what about the ones you haven't done? But we'll do it. Maybe we'll do a part 2 sometime. But it's always fun just chatting anyway. It's like one of our regular conversations, just that we've got several hundred people watching us, which is really cool. But it's been great. So folks, don't forget to check out Joe's podcast and his writing and his tours. But I will be seeing you all again tomorrow, because we are talking about one of the flag raisers on Iwo Jima, another subject that has been written about ad infinitum, some of it good, some of it bad. But we'll do that tomorrow. So cheers, everybody. Don't forget to click like and subscribe. Check out my guests' websites, and I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers. Bye.